students in this class, and the question is, what if you have dynamic DNS? Okay, in other words, your IP address keeps changing all the time, and somehow you need to access your computer at home. So the question is, do you need to get a static IP? That's the question. So let me just re-explain what I mean by that, okay? And the best way to do it, since I have everything online already, is to add a resource, compose a web page. So this way I can try my best to document what I'm talking about, so you guys don't have to watch the entire video clip just to, just to understand that part of the lecture. Okay, so here's my scenario, okay? A computer has a dynamic IP. So this means the IP address changes, every so often. Okay? So imagine that your phone number is changing all the time. Okay? When you dial out on your cell phone number gets changed all the time. Sometimes it's 555-1234, sometimes it's 555-1235, and so on and so forth. And worst of all, there's no way for you to predict when your cell phone will have which number. So it's completely unpredictable. You can only guess that it will be within a certain range because the network address has to be the same in this case. Okay, so we have this little problem here. Okay, another computer on the internet has to access this computer. So you have one computer, I think the example that I would like to use is an IP camera at home. Okay, you set up, a few of those IP cameras at home, hoping that you can monitor, like your backyard, your front yard, has the UPS guy dropped off a package and so on and so forth from where you work. And IP cameras are inexpensive now. They used to be like hundreds of dollars, and now even for a good quality one, it's less than $100. And the best part of an IP camera is, if you get a wireless type, all you need is to give it power, which is a whole lot easier than routing the AV cable or a Cat5 cable all the way from one end of your house to the other end of the house. So they're good, they're very useful. But the problem is, in order to access the camera, you need to get back to your home computer first, or at least the home network first. So the question is, how do we do that? And particularly, what if your home computer has a dynamic IP, which means it will keep asking, every so often it will ask the ISP and say, well, the lease of this particular IP address has expired. Mr. ISP, what is my new IP address? And that can change, every so often. Okay, so that's the problem, because, if you don't know the phone number of someone, how do you call that person? That's the question. So I'll just write down here the phone number analogy. If the phone number of a person keeps changing, how do you call that person? Okay, that's the question. And fortunately, we do have mechanisms that are available for free to do this sort of thing. So it depends on how elaborate you want the setup to be. So one option, okay, so let me just write down the options here. Option 1, and then we have option 2. Okay, option 1, which is the easy one, and your ISP will just give you this option. Option 1 is to get a static IP. Okay? A static IP, as the name implies, as opposed to a dynamic IP, means the ISP will always assign a particular IP address to your computer. It is either done by your login name and your password, or done by your MAC address. They have a few different mechanisms to do it. Well, it is very nice, because once you get a static IP, it's done. Okay, whether you have a domain name corresponding to the IP address is a separate issue, because you can always go back to the computer by that one single static IP. But this is expensive. It depends on who your carrier is, or who your ISP is in this case. Some ISPs, as soon as you request a static IP, they will turn your account from a residential account to a commercial account, like right there. Okay? and you will see everything, the base rate would just go like twice, get twice or tripled because of that. Because they charge commercial accounts a whole lot more than they charge, with residential accounts. So sometimes it's nice, it's easy, you request a static IP address and it's done, but depending on your ISP, it may or may not be a cost-effective solution. This depends on the ISP. In this case, in the case of Shore West, you add about $4 or $5 per month for a static IP, and that was it. And I find it to be a very reasonable price, just for $4 or $5 over maybe $75, for phone and internet and whatnot. So $5 more is not really bad for a static IP because it does make my life a whole lot easier having a static IP. But if you go for AT&T, I believe they charge a whole lot more for having a static IP. Can anyone say anything about that? You guys know? You have AT&T?
Yeah.
Have you asked them how much it would cost to get a static IP?
No, I haven't, because I didn't even know I could.
Exactly. You probably can, but when you get a static IP, they will probably have to upgrade your account from residential to commercial first. That was at least how it was about 15 years ago. When I requested a static IP, they had to upgrade my account from residential to commercial first. So I have to pay I think 2.5 times more at the same data rate just because I want to have a static IP. So that may not be a good option, for certain ISPs. It may not even be available as an option. If you have a particular ISP, they may decide residential accounts should not need static IPs, and they will just flat out say you cannot have a static IP. So it's not even an option, regardless of how much you're willing to pay. So the second option is to sign up for I would just call it an IP lookup service. Now, this is interesting because what is happening is your computer knows when its IP address is getting changed. In other words, the ISP cannot change the IP address of your computer at home without your computer actually knowing it. Now, you may have a router doing this job, you may have your own computer doing this job, but something that belongs to you will know that the IP address is getting changed. Okay? So in this case, what happens if I want to show the order of events, it will be like this. 1, your home computer realizes the IP lease is up. It requests an IP address from the ISP. Okay? Because every time you request an IP address using DHCP, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, it will also associate a certain lease time to the IP address. It typically goes from 1 day to several hours. If you have a static IP, it basically is an infinite number. Okay, you can keep this IP address, for eternity. So in other words, your computer is the one that has to actively say, okay, is my lease up? Is my lease up? Is my lease up? Oh, my lease is up. I have to ask the ISP DHCP server for possibly a new IP address. Sometimes they can give you the same one, and other times they will change it to another one. So step 2 is your home computer or your router realizes that your IP address has changed. So your home computer updates the IP lookup service with the new IP address. Because your computer actually knows that the IP address has changed. So now it can basically update a directory of IP addresses and say, oh, this particular computer has updated its IP address. Okay? And with this particular scheme, then any computer on the internet can then use the IP lookup service to look up the actual IP address of this computer. Okay? And there are several companies that will do that. Some will offer entry-level free services, which is fine for most people. If all you want to do is to get back to your home computer and watch the front porch video clip of the front porch camera, one service that can do this. Okay, should not do it here. Let's do it here. One company that I know of is called NoIPcom. So NoIP.com is basically they offer a free service, create a free host name and point to your dynamic IP. In other words, to get back to your home computer, you have to first register for an account and you have to register for a particular name. So let's say in my case, I want to call my home IP address associated with a symbolic name like Dr. Tech's computer. Okay. So what I need to do is to sign up with NoIP.com, register for that name to make sure that I'm the only one using that name. And after that, whenever I use no-ip.com / and then followed by the name of the symbolic name that I have chosen, it will resolve it to an IP address. And that IP address will be almost always fresh, except during the time it is being changed. So there can be, like glitches, like you request this, and in the process of no-IP replying to your computer that is outside somewhere, your computer at home decides to change the IP address. So there may be instances where your IP address can be wrong, but the frequency of that happening should be relatively low, and most of the time it will work just fine. Okay. So are there any questions about what I'm talking about here? It's not exactly DNS per se. It is another type of directory or lookup service, because in this case, at least for the free service, you have to use no-ip.com / and then followed by the name that you have chosen. But if you're not making a web server and you don't really care whether other people can find you and you only want to be able to find your own computer, this is perfectly fine. Okay. Do we have any questions at this point? No questions? Okay. If there are no questions, we can move on. We are basically done, or almost done, with chapters 6 and also 7. Chapter 7 talks about the web, HTML, and etc. Are there any questions when you guys read chapters 6 and 7? No questions? Okay. I do realize one thing when in chapter 6, they talked about all the different types of technology the ISPs or the internet service providers would use to provide service. They talked about DSL. They talked about cable modem and whatnot. They talked about Wi-Fi, WiMAX, basically. It's a high-speed, wide area type of Wi-Fi. But they never mentioned anything about fiber. I was surprised that they did not mention fiber optics.
That's like Verizon's Fios, right?
Or Shore West. Shore West is mostly fiber these days. And fiber is interesting because the data bandwidth is really high. I think the hardware, the wire itself, or the fiber optic cable itself, is capable of easily at least 2 gigabits per second. You only get about 10 to 20 depending on how much you pay, because they want to kind of crank it down to make sure that people don't saturate their pipes upstream. But the actual possible speed of the wire itself is in orders of gigabits per second, and it's symmetric. Unlike DSL, DSL is asymmetric. You can get a lot of speed downloading, but you don't get a whole lot of speed uploading. Which means in the context of watching your security camera, it may not be a very good option, because surfing stuff out of your home has a much lower cap in terms of how fast it can be streaming. But with fiber optics, it's symmetric. I get 15